Workload Manager allows for the processing of large sets of data. It does this by creating a queue for data to be stored. Automations then pick up a work item from the queue and process it, mark it complete, and then move on to the next work item. Where Workload Manager really becomes powerful is when multiple bot runners can execute automations to pull items from the queue simultaneously. What does this mean? Well, if a single bot runner can process 100 queue items in an hour, we could be able to process twice that with 2 bot runners, and up to 10 times that with 10 bot runners. Where would you need such data processing power? Understanding this is paramount to your decision to use Workload Manager at all. Let's take a moment to discuss how Workload Manager works. Then we'll talk about some logical use cases. Each of the queues in the Workload Manager are designed to handle one structure of data and one only. For example, if we're receiving updated healthcare information from everyone in our company, the queue will look something like this. Make sure to have a good idea of the data that you need in your queue, because you can't modify it later. One way to future-proof your queue is to have a separate field that holds additional values in XML or JSON format. Now, let's talk about processing with these queues. Automation number 1 can gather information from somewhere and put the data into the queue. This can be done quickly since automation number 1 is just gathering data. It's not processing anything. Automation number 2 pulls items from the queue and processes them. Let's say the system it's working with runs a bit slow, so it takes automation 2 longer to work on each queue item. With automation number 1 running on one bot runner and automation number 2 running on another bot runner, this frees up the first bot runner to do other things while the second one is still busy. Where the magic starts is when you have multiple bot runners running automation number 2. Now you're processing data in parallel. So let's review so far. First, you have to have a consistent structure of data. Second, you must create a Workload Manager queue that matches that structure of data. Third, create an automation to add data to the queue. Fourth, create an automation that pulls an item from the queue and processes it, then marks the item complete. There is another way to add items to the queue. You may create a specially formatted Excel or CSV file and import it into the queue, but this is most useful for testing. What about queue items that don't process correctly? As the automations process the queue items, they may mark the items as complete, incomplete, or failed. This lets the other bot runners processing the queues know which items are next in the queue. If you really wanted to get fancy, you could even use Automation Anywhere's API from your web application to add items to the queue directly. For example, this web page displays a form for the healthcare information. When the user clicks the Submit button, 2 API calls are set in motion. The Authentication API to get an authorization token, and then the API call to add the information into the workload queue. When we enter this information into the web page and click Submit, then go to the workload queue, we immediately see that the information has been entered, at least the columns that we marked as visible in the control room. For data privacy reasons, we're only displaying the first name and last name columns. Now that we have this data in the queue, let's talk about making an automation that will be able to pull that information from the queue one record at a time and perform some action on the data. In our case, we're keeping it simple and just displaying the records on screen. In the real world, we would have the automation sign into an application, get to the appropriate screen, and enter the information into the application, then sign out. Workload items are brought in here in the work item template. We choose which template we want, and that brings in all of the fields for us. This puts that information into the variables section into the work item. Each one of those work items will be put into a record variable. Each column of this record variable is a string, so if you have a data type that needs to be converted, you need to do that first. If I need to convert my data from the work item form, in this case it's date of birth, and we need to convert that to a string for processing in a message box. And we can do the same thing here with an employee ID and the number of dependents. Once I've got all that displayed, I can then put each one of those fields into my message box or use that in my automation for populating some external system. To simulate the successful or unsuccessful processing of a queue, I put in a prompt option that will allow us to mark that record complete or incomplete depending on which option that we select, yes or no. If it's a yes, we set the work item result to complete. If it's no, we set the work item result to incomplete. Now, running the automation is also a bit different. First of all, it has to be checked into public. Second, it has to be run with the Run Bot with Queue option. Once we have the queue selected, we can then run the bots on whichever bot runners that we have available. In this case, I don't have any bot runners available, but you get the idea. So what did we learn here? Workload Manager is the process of defining a data structure and adding items to the queue for later processing. The queues are not flexible, so only use Workload Manager with well-defined data that doesn't change over time. Items can be added to the queue from a CSV or an Excel file, an automation, or through Automation Anywhere's Control Room API. To add some flexibility to your queues, consider adding a field in XML or JSON format at the end of your queue for additional fields. When queue items are available, one or many bot runners may process the items from the queue, making the possibility of much faster processing of queued items. Thanks for watching, and go be great.